So, given the actions of the Prime Minister's principal secretary and his chief of staff, do we still have a spending scandal here? Do we have a government that was meeting its obligations to the people who come from across Canada to work in government? But a lot of that story's changed now with the fact that these two individuals closely placed to the Prime Minister have decided to pay back some, but not all of the money they claim from the government for relocating to Ottawa. Let's follow up on this with three MPs, Liberal MP Marco Mendicino from the foyer of the House tonight, Conservative MP Blaine Calkins, who's been raising the expenses issue in the House daily this week, and New Democrat MP Daniel Blaikie. Good to see you all.
Good to see you, Peter.
So, late developments this evening, Mr. Mendicino, on this story with Katie Telford deciding that she will pay back just over $23,000 of the over $70,000, as I do the quick math here, that she claimed for relocating to Ottawa. And Mr. Butts is paying back almost $21,000 in what are called these personalized expenses, plus he's paying back land transfer tax for his move to Ottawa out of the $125,000 that he claimed in relocation expenses. Where does that leave us on this story?
Well, just to clarify your opening remarks, I think you used the expression spending scandal. Is there still one? There never was one, and that's because there were a set of rules, or there are a set of rules in place within which these expenses were submitted. You know, they both Ms. Telford and Mr. Butts took a closer look at those expenses, and upon reflection decided that some of them were not reasonable and therefore left them uncomfortable. And so, based on that reflection, they have decided, in the interest of openness and transparency, to reimburse the people.
Well, when did they become uncomfortable?
Well, listen. I mean, ultimately, that would have been in the very short term, within the last, I would imagine, the last number of hours. So,
well, since I guess the questions began being asked about the spending, about the reimbursement.
It's a recent development, I think is the most accurate way of putting it. But look, again, I mean, I think what you have here is a situation where there were a set of rules. It is not uncommon practice to have people who are public servants, who have to relocate, who have to uproot their families, who sometimes ask their partners to change jobs and have their children change schools to recover some of those costs, which are not insignificant, and that can be region specific.
Let me just, before I move on to your colleagues here, so the claim by the opposition on this story this week was that the amount of money being reimbursed was unreasonable. And the government position was that the guidelines are there, the policy's there. Now the story shifts because the two people at the center of it now agree they're unreasonable.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Peter.
Mr. Mendicino, that's what's happened here is they've now decided that the stuff they were allowed to claim is unreasonable.
Well, they have, and you know that's certainly within their purview, and I think that you know, again, it was in keeping with the principles of this government, which is to be open and transparent and to be fair. And so, look, at the end of the day, they have decided to reimburse. I don't think that you would characterize it the way that you did at the outset of the introductory remarks, and
well,
that's because
I did present it as a scandal. Do we have a spending? I presented it as a question.
I take issue with that characterization because there are a set of rules. And by the way, my friends may not like the rules, but that certainly didn't stop them from abiding by the same framework, which has been in place for a number of years now. And I would just add one other important thing, which is that Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister, has asked I believe the Treasury Board
to come up with a new set of rules.
To take a look at the rules, to perhaps modernize them so that we can have a higher bar on transparency going forward.
Okay, Mr. Calkins, what's happened here?
Well, clearly the Liberals have been caught with their hand in the cookie jar again. This is a trend. This is not the first time in this short, not even a year of this government, where people who are working for either staffers, or now we have the top two staff in the entire organization, paying back money because they've been caught. Look, the reality is, when the story broke a couple of days ago, the Liberals have been reading the winds of change on this in the court of public opinion and have decided to backtrack. It's only a problem now that they've finally been caught. Look, most Canadians will still say that the amount of money that's been charged to them is outrageous. It's a pittance that's been paid back, and there's still numerous other staffers, still to the tune of $1.1 million of the moving expenses that are just over the top.
Mr. Blaikie, what do you think happened here? Why is the money being repaid? Should it have been repaid?
Well, I mean, clearly the Liberals have finally figured out that when Canadians look at this kind of expenditure just for moving, there's something that doesn't wash there. So we've got a self-styled champion of the middle class in the Prime Minister who didn't bat an eye when he was signing off on moving expenses of over 6 figures. Most people that I I know, a lowly electrician here, would look at moving expenses in the six figures and at least ask some hard questions. So the fact that it's taken repeated days of questioning in the House of Commons and lots of media attention to get them to go back and look at that and then admit that, yeah, actually, upon analysis, anyway, not according to our judgment, but the judgment of Canadians, this is unreasonable, I don't think inspires a lot of confidence in the judgment of a government that's going out and spending a lot of money. I think Canadians expect that they're going to have responsible officials who can look at a price tag like that for something as simple as a move and go, wait a second, there's something up here, we have to ask questions, and is this something that Canadians would really expect to be seen as reasonable?
Mr. Mendicino, I guess if the rules are going to be reviewed, how should they be reviewed? What should they say? Because what they say now, and this was part of this conversation about the obligation to pay, the responsibility to pay, entitlements, and so on. But for exempt staff, the existing rule as it exists says this: a minister may, at his or her discretion, reimburse the relocation expenses of political exempt staff. May at his or her discretion. So they don't have to be paid for those moves for people who take on these exempt staff jobs. Any benefits are negotiated between the minister and the individual. So if the rules are going to be changed, how should they be changed? Should it be clear that well in advance should say, look, this is what we pay if you come, and I don't know if you can get this detail, this is what we pay if you come from Toronto, this is what we pay if you come from Alberta. How do you reframe them?
Well, I think that's all in the offing, and I don't want to predetermine what the exact contours of that discussion will be like, but what I do think it signals is an intent, an ongoing intent of this government to have a dialogue with the opposition, with the Canadian public, about ways in which we can continue to improve the administration of the reimbursement of public expenses. And so that is exactly what we're doing. And I just want to take a slight issue with what my friend Mr. Blakey said about not batting an eye. I don't think Mr. Blakey was with the Prime Minister, and I would reject any notion that somehow he was not interested in the review of this process. What's important is that we've been very transparent about it. We have been willing to talk about this issue. There's nothing wrong with Canadians wading into it, and we are going to continue to abide by the high standards that they expect from this government, which is a marked departure from, I think, the last administration.
All right. In the statement that Mr. Butts put out this evening, Mr. Calkins, he writes, when we reviewed these costs, that's he and Katie Telford, we decided that the amount called personalized cash payout, so that's something you get, I guess, for incidentals and so on. In her case, $23,373.71, and in his case, $20,799. They're both repaying those. And he writes, the principle we took to these decisions is that we should only be reimbursed the actual cost we paid third parties to make the move happen. So they weren't comfortable about these expenses, and when they reviewed them, they decided they should pay them back. Do you accept that?
Well, they were perfectly comfortable with them when they submitted those expenses for reimbursement. Look, this isn't a rule problem. This is an entitlement problem inside this Liberal government, and it's a judgment problem coming right from the Prime Minister himself, who signed off on these expense claims for his two top staff, and it's a judgment problem for the other ministers who also signed off on some pretty extravagant costs, over $1.1 million in moving costs to get people here. Look, Peter, this is a trend that we're seeing. It's about entitlement. It's about disrespecting taxpayers, and this government just is entitled to its entitlements, no different than previous Liberal administrations.
All right, what did the Conservatives do? Did you pay for people to come to Ottawa for jobs?
Look, we can go back and take a look at the records. If you remember Stephen Harper, he did not like abuse of taxpayers' dollars in any way, shape, or form. That's the Stephen Harper that I remember. I know that the rules would have been the same rules that would have been in place, but the implementation of those rules would have been much different between Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau.
Not all Canadians remember Mr. Harper the same way, and they may recall an allegation that a chief of staff to Mr. Harper cut a personal check to keep this kind of issue out of the public light. And it was a number of months before it was brought into the public domain where we had a discussion. So if some of the indignation that we're hearing from the opposition seems a bit ironic, I think Canadians will know why.
Well, the difference between paying $93,000 back and claiming over $200,000 is night and day.
Mr. Blakey, should people who come to Ottawa to take jobs in government even if they're exempt staff, are they entitled to have the cost of their moves covered?
Well, I mean, I think most people might think it's reasonable.
Members of Parliament do. Members of Parliament get paid for
I think
moves.
most people might think it reasonable to reimburse moving expenses, but I just can't fathom how you get to $100,000 as a moving expense. And so there's lots of people in the trades, for example, that moved to Alberta in the good days and are moving home now. And when they're selling houses, no one's reimbursing the fees that they pay to their real estate agent, for instance. So I mean, there's moving expenses in terms of what it costs to move the contents of your home and to move your family. But if the policy permits you to get up into the six figures, I just can't understand how it takes $100,000 or more to move one family from Toronto to Ottawa, and I don't think most people do.
All right. Well, of course, now the government is undertaking to review those expenses and how they're claimed and how much will be paid. We'll continue to follow the story. Thanks for your time tonight.
Thanks, Peter.
Take
Have
care.
a good one.